My friends, good day. Today we're going to discuss a particularly dramatic story, one that unfortunately cost the life of a Moroccan family. They had come to the Grenoble area on December 28, 2012 to spend their vacation. By January 5, they were dead. There were the parents, the father who was piloting the plane, the mother, and 3 children. It's a story that had shocked Morocco in 2013. Today we're going to take a look at what happened and the lessons that this tragedy holds. First of all, we're going to start by describing the region a little bit because the plane took off from Grenoble Airport. Grenoble is a region I know well because I spent a few years of my life in that area. I would have stayed even longer if things had turned out differently. Actually, we have a runway that's oriented west-east like this, along this axis as you see it. And what we have is that this runway is in a valley. That means when you're in the Grenoble area, when you're in Isère, when you look around you, you see mountains almost everywhere. So basically that's what we have, okay, geography wise, but basically what we have is when we take off heading 0.9, when we take off here on 0.9, when we take off to the east, that's basically what we have. Here, the horizon is closed off by what we call the chartreuse. So these are pretty high mountains. It literally forms a wall. Here, basically what we're going to have the Vercors. Okay, we're going to have the Vercors. In this area, we have a kind of land that starts to rise. It's not mountains yet, but it's going to start going up. When you look from the track, you see the land rising, and further back is the glass barrier. Here, we basically have the Pilat, all right? And then a bit lower down there, we start to see the Ardèche Mountains. So just to tell you, it's an extremely mountainous region. He wanted to head north where it's flat and we're going toward Lyon. All right, so if you want, the region as you see here is quite... When you have a small plane, it's still a region that can present some particular challenges. We are in January, that means winter weather. The weather is going to play an extremely important role. So just to give you an idea of the weather, there were 2 cloud layers that day. So the first cloud layer, the one we're particularly interested in because that's the one the pilot will see first. It was at 700 feet. So the first cloud layer started at 700 feet. So we have this layer that's very low. It was about 2,000 feet thick, but actually right after that, a second layer started. The distance between the two, according to Météo France, was about 200 to 300 feet. So in reality, the 2 layers actually come into contact with each other. The break might not even be visible in reality. So to get started, if you want, that day there were 2 planes. There are 2 planes heading to Morocco with a scheduled stopover in Spain. So the whole challenge, if you want, the whole challenge is leaving this region you see, which is very difficult. So the first plane, here's what it's going to do. It's going to take off and then it's going to do a 180 degrees, which means turning around. And then it's going to go here, practically against the direction of the runway. So you see, it's going to fly parallel to the runway to avoid this area, to avoid that one, right? And when it gets there to a point we call the whiskey point, well, then it's going to head south. So here you have the VOR Montélimar Mectangolima. That's the Montélimar VOR. So once we get to Montélimar, then there's Avignon. And then once we get there, we're good, it's over. Why? Because once we get to Avignon and then we see Montélimar on the right, well, what happens is that we start to see the sea and then we can relax a bit. As for terrain from there, it's much easier to manage because the problem is when you have flat terrain like the sea or coastal areas, and then if you have clouds, it's okay. You can always manage because you know that down below it's pretty predictable, and up above, well, you have the clouds, you just stay out of them. On the other hand, the problem is when you're in a mountainous region where the ground sometimes rises up to meet those clouds. So in the end, what happens is it leaves you in a corridor. and you really have to stick to that corridor to make it through. So as I was saying, we have a first plane that's going to arrive safe and sound at its destination. It's a DA-42. So it takes off, turns around, reaches the Whiskey Point, and then heads toward Montélimar 15 minutes later. We have our pilot. So our pilot's name is Farid Berrada. He's with his family. As I was saying, he has 500 flight hours, but be careful, he's not trained. He doesn't have any training for instrument flying, so that means he's a pilot who did most of his training in Morocco. So we're in weather conditions that are a bit less tricky than what you might find in the Isère area. And so he was certified and qualified to fly visually, not to fly using instruments. So he had to stay out of the clouds. If he went into the clouds, well, there you go. That's already a pre-catastrophic situation. If you have to fly using instruments, that means you have to keep the ground in sight at all times. Landmarks like highways, lakes, mountains, obstacles, you have to keep them in sight. As a visual pilot, you always have a map. You can use a global positioning system, you can use an instrument, all that, that's fine, there's no problem. You're allowed to do that. Flying is mainly visual for visual pilots, so without visibility, you're quickly headed for disaster. So the plane we're talking about is a Piper Aircraft 34, so it's a twin-engine propeller plane, and the registration is CN. Charlie November, Delta Alpha Yankee. So he wasn't the pilot, he wasn't the owner, he had rented or borrowed it from someone. He was flying it because he owned a plane, but it was actually a much lighter single-engine plane. And that day, since he was leaving with his family and all that on vacation, he had borrowed that plane. The thing is, the CN day, that day when he takes off, he's already a bit heavy. He's already 140 kilos over. All right, it's a twin engine plane. He's carrying 2 adults. One of the kids is a teenager and 2 of the kids are very young. 45 kilo of luggage, so they weren't excessive with the luggage. He has 45 kilo, 350 kilo of fuel. Even so, you see, we're already over the certified maximum takeoff weight. What's going to happen with that? Not much actually, but here's what will happen. The risk with planes that are too heavy is that their performance is reduced. That means the climb won't go as well as we would have wanted, as we would have hoped. And actually the other problem as well is that in case of an engine failure, you'll have to handle a plane with one engine out that's also overloaded. There's no guarantee, not necessarily going to the ground, so we'll keep going. What we have is that 15 minutes after the first plane took off, the first plane, as I said, was CNTSA Tongo. Charlie Alpha, it's a DA-42. Okay, it's a DA-42. It's a twin-engine plane, also much more modern than the Piper Aircraft 34. So what happens is that our plane will take off 15 minutes after the first one. So the first one leaves, and 15 minutes later, the second one, which is the one we're interested in, will take off. So what he does is, based on the training this pilot had on this plane, he will take off and quite quickly he will engage. The autopilot is a fairly common training. You'll find it in the United States, in Europe, everywhere people are taught. You take off, you turn on the autopilot. That's actually what airlines do. If you have an airport, an Emirates A380 taking off, the guys won't fly manually for long. They'll soon turn on the autopilot. But there's a difference. If for some reason the autopilot fails, they're able to fly manually, even in the clouds. That's the first point. Second point, they have several autopilots. There are redundant systems that ensure the autopilot will work. That's already the case. The problem with small planes is that the autopilot is kind of the neglected part of the systems. You find autopilots that have varying levels of performance, some better, some worse. It's not something that's highly reliable, so that's something you really need to keep in mind. So what happens is that our aircraft takes off. And why am I talking about the autopilot? Why? Well, we know there isn't a black box in this story, but how do we know? It's because when you look at the radar track of the planes, you can tell whether they're being flown by autopilot or by a human pilot. The difference is that with a human pilot, you have freedom. If you're flying manually, you'll regularly notice that your altitude might have dropped a bit. You'll correct it. You'll see that your course, your flight is drifting, or the heading you wanted has drifted slightly. So you correct it. You're constantly making micro corrections that are visible on the radar. Whereas when you have an autopilot in control, it's relatively precise. It makes nice tracks on a map. It's perfect with little or no variation. So we know it. So our pilot takes off, and quite quickly, he's going to engage the autopilot somewhere around here. Let's agree. He's going to engage the autopilot. In this case, what we're going to have is a turn that's going to start to the right to go like this. So the idea is, if you want this turn, when you look at it, it's roughly, I say 210 degrees. I had tests done in simulators. So 210 degrees, that's what it corresponds to. Bea's report suggests it matches a direct route to Montélimar. What does that mean? Towards the edge of Montélimar, that's what it means. The autopilot was probably set to navigation mode, so it was programmed, so the routes were programmed. So after takeoff, directly to Montélimar, then straight to the Avignon VOR, and so on. So when it was engaged in navigation mode, the plane made a very nice turn and then went straight ahead while climbing. And then it entered the cloud to go directly toward Montélimar. Just a detail about why the plane was able to take off even though we didn't have the visual flight rules minimums. Actually, there's a standard that we often say there are two flight modes, there are two flight rules, if you will. There's visual flight rules, visual flight, okay, in visual conditions. And then we have instrument flight rules flight, which is instrument flight. Now there's something between them. Honestly, I've never seen anyone do it, okay? And I don't think it should exist. It probably exists because in the past it had a reason to be. It exists because it comes up in exams. But honestly, if you want to live a long life, I advise you to remove that completely from your everyday practice. What we call special visual flight rules is when sometimes we don't have visual flight rules conditions. We have conditions below visual flight rules. So what do? You can request special visual flight rules clearance from the air traffic controller. It may or may not be granted. Generally, there's no reason for them not to grant it. But be careful, it's under the pilot's responsibility, not the controller's. So here, our pilot took off with a special visual flight rules clearance. Now, I'd like to take this opportunity to maybe tell you something about this story. There's a blind spot in aviation safety. Why? When you look at it, you have the gradient. We're all aware of that, the authority gradient. Between the captain and the co-pilot, we know that if the captain is someone very experienced with gray hair, beside him is a 19-and-a-half-year-old guy. It's true that this guy who just joined the company tends to feel a bit under a strong authority gradient. He might feel overwhelmed. We know the accidents that have happened. There are plenty of them in this channel. Now, there's something else, and there's no documentation that talks about it. It's the gradient of implicit authority that can exist between the pilot and the air traffic controller. That is, when you have seasoned pilots. They deal as equals. Experienced pilots deal as equals with air traffic controllers. So they can even refuse certain things. I have a friend who's a pilot on an Airbus A380. Well, one day he was in New York. During the approach, there was a controller who gave him an instruction. He wanted him to shorten the approach and everything. He said, no, I'm not going to do it. Why? Because what he was asking would speed things up too much and all that. He said, no, I'm not doing it. Thank you. And sometimes in stories like that, it can pretty quickly, it can even escalate sometimes between pilots. I have another pilot friend who once got into an argument with an air traffic controller on the frequency. And then it was about a turn after takeoff, to the left or to the right. The controller said left, the pilot said right. After takeoff, the pilot picks up the radio and calls the controller saying, look, your left turn. And then with that, the Boeing turns right. All right, so it wasn't a great day for aviation. To be honest, okay, these aren't scenes that we'd want to see. I'm just showing you that sometimes pilots and controllers end up talking on the phone or with a supervisor later just to resolve issues they've had. Why? Because there's a shared responsibility. It's the controller's airspace or sky, but it's my plane. Okay, so there are certain limits that need to be respected. Where we have a problem is with less experienced pilots, and especially those who might find themselves abroad. They're outside their country, like here. We have a Moroccan pilot. He finds himself, he's not an airline pilot, he's basically a private pilot. He finds himself in a country he doesn't know. So, in a way, there's a gradient of authority, even if it's not something intentional on the part of the controller. When he asks to leave, he's under a flight plan, visual flight rules. If I were the controller, I would have refused the departure and stayed silent. All right, you refuse the departure, then, well, you let him handle it. You let him, either he tells you, okay, I'm leaving on instruments. If he's qualified or wants to leave on special visual flight rules, there's no problem. He decides and tells me. The problem we have here, it's not to blame the controller, right? It's just to explain how things can happen structurally. It's that the controller will suggest special visual flight rules, and when the controller suggests it, it can lead to a misunderstanding by the pilot. So if he suggests it to me, it means it's allowed. If he suggests it to me, it means it's normal. If he suggests it to me, it means it's okay, I can do it. The pilot, not the controller, must make that decision. Okay, so our pilot takes off, engages the autopilot, the cap bam automatically follows the 210. We're heading straight to Montélimar. Okay, now something is going to happen. And this thing is very, very hard to explain. It's that we don't understand why at some point the autopilot was disconnected. Why? It could simply be a manual disconnection because the pilot says to himself, oh, I'm heading toward the mountainous area. He doesn't necessarily see it. It might appear from time to time. It's quite frightening. When flying through clouds, you occasionally spot a rock which then disappears from view again. As a visual flight rules pilot, you must maintain contact, but now you've lost it and don't know where you're going. So why? Because when we do instrument flight rules, instrument flights, that's not what instrument flights are. What we call a standard instrument departure, which is prepared. There's a prepared departure route that offers all the guarantees. We don't need to see the mountain, but we know that the route we're following is prepared for that. But when we leave in visual flight rules, there's still a degree of improvisation. So our pilot here will disconnect the autopilot, or the autopilot disconnects itself. The reason is that potentially maybe at that moment he thinks it might not be a good idea to fly over this area with the rising terrain. Maybe it's better to do that and go toward the whiskey point. Maybe that's what he wanted to do. Who knows? Maybe he wanted to change. It's not good to cut across like that between us. If he had cut across and kept going straight toward Montélimar with his eyes closed, he would have reached Montélimar easily. Because the terrain here is impressive, but it doesn't rise that much. So after all, he would have passed over the hills. But that might not be information he had at the time. The only thing he remembers is that he's in the area and that he's surrounded by mountains, which makes him want to return to the valley. Potentially, I'm saying this, potentially we don't know, or maybe the other option, maybe the somatic pilot jumped out alone. It happens. There's a case in this story, in this channel. It's a Pilatus, and there's also a family that was wiped out by this. So it's a Pilatus, and the same thing. What happened is that the automatic somatic pilot let them go in mid-flight. We don't really know why. We don't know. All right. Watch the video. You'll see some theories. But it can happen. It lets you go. It lets you go. You're all alone. So what happens from that moment on? We're in manual control. That's it. We're in manual control. What happens here, the type of scene we have is very well known, very well described. What we call the transition from visual meteorological conditions to instrument meteorological conditions. It means a transition from flying in visual conditions to instrument flight conditions unexpectedly. It kills constantly every year and takes lives. In 2013, we lost Julien Clerc's brother. He died. He was flying in the Loire Valley. He was on a DA-40, a single engine plane. He had 2 passengers with him. They were going to La Baule. There you go. At some point, the clouds lowered, and they flew into them. And then The only thing we know is that later the plane came out in a desperate situation and then it crashed. All three died. It kills all the time in most cases. It deciphers a TSB in most cases. It happens en route. 70% happen en route. 70% of these incidents happen during cruise. Why? Because people are flying and then suddenly the conditions around them deteriorate. Only 12% of these situations happen at departure. Okay, only 12%. Why? Because pilots in general are well trained enough to recognize when the situation isn't good and don't take off. Okay, but it can happen. There's the Association of American Pilots website, the Association of American Pilots. They give an example of a pilot who couldn't even fly a King, a visual flight rules pilot. He couldn't see the taxis or find the runway because the fog and conditions were so bad. He requested a follow me, so they sent a vehicle and he followed it to the runway. A family was also on the plane. He overshot the runway, crashed in a nearby field, and everyone died. So it's rare, but it does happen during takeoff. That's the specific case we have here, so we're happy to share it. It lasts 5 minutes for the information, okay? Starting from takeoff, releasing the brakes. There are 5 minutes until impact. The impact here, it will be around a village called Saint-Jouard here somewhere. There's a small village called Saint-Jouard. And then the impact happened there. So what is it? The last one. How did the plane behave? It entered a spiral turn, sometimes called the death spiral or graveyard spiral. All right, in English, if you want, this is how you do the turn. It's done on a descending horizontal plane. How does it work? Like this. I have a plane here. Look, it's a plane. I took it from the island, but it doesn't change anything. The aerodynamics are the same. It's a Douglas commercial. 10 it fell. Honestly, it fell. And the cleaning lady broke it, so I'm trying to fix it. She was very sorry. I told her, don't worry. It's a Douglas commercial. 10. We're used to these planes. So look at what happens. You're flying in a plane. There are small micro disturbances. When the plane tilts 20 degrees, what happens next? Sure, look, this is lift. Now the lift isn't vertical but angled, so there's less lift supporting. So what does the plane do? The nose will drop, it will start to descend. Okay, obviously, a plane that tilts, if you're in a plane, no matter the size, it's balanced, that's it, it's perfectly balanced, trimmed and everything. If you tilt it by 20 degrees and do nothing else, it will descend. What do we do in a turn? In a turn, we pull on the stick. That's right, we pull on the stick to compensate for the plane's tendency to descend. And if necessary, we even add some throttle. All right, so if we bank a lot now, if we're flying and the plane banks and descends, what should we do? If it was an unwanted bank, we're not going to pull on the yoke, we're going to level the wings instead. When we level the wings, the plane returns to its previous position and stops descending. That's when we have visual reference and visibility. After checking the map, they notice the plane tilting and descending. A quick tap on the control stick levels the plane and things calm down. That's what happens when untrained people go into the clouds. There's a statistic that says they lose control on average in 178 seconds, just under 3 minutes. It's a pretty old statistic from a study that was done in 1954 on airplanes. Pilots can get disoriented, lose control, lose situational awareness, lose the horizon, lose their reference points, and lose control of the aircraft. Typically, it takes between 20 and 400 seconds, averaging 3 minutes. In a helicopter, it's 56 seconds, more challenging. It's a fairly old study from the 1950s, but basically, there's no reason to think things are any different today. So, as I was saying, what happens is, there you go. That's how we go to the cemetery. It's rarely explained. I couldn't find any text that explains this and everything, so I'll give you this explanation. Look, the plane is tilting. What are we doing? There are two ways to bring it back to the horizon and stop the fall. Level it out or pull on the stick. That's where the problem is. It's that pilots, when they enter the cloud, when they're not trained for it, what happens is they don't use their instruments properly. The plane tilts gently after a while and they may not notice it. The inner ear is poor at detecting slow movement. A plane can tilt 20 degrees without you noticing. On the other hand, there's one thing you feel very clearly, and that's the drop. So the plane starts to go downward. When you have that drop, you feel it in your stomach, you feel it very clearly. So what do? We instinctively correct by pulling on the stick. So we pull on the stick. And what will happen is that when we pull on the stick, we will increase the angle of attack. If we don't add power, the plane will tend to descend even more. So we pull. And often what happens is that pilots start correcting in a chaotic way and sometimes even increase the bank angle. When they increase the bank angle, the plane tends to fall even faster to compensate for this drop. They pull on the stick, they see one thing, they see the speed increasing. You know, it's like water in a sink that's draining like that. The tighter the spiral, the faster you go. If you're banked, say at 20 degrees, speed increases even more. You're at 30, 45, 60, 70, and 90. The deeper we are in the spiral, the more the plane banks and the faster its speed increases. So when the speed increases, the pilot, he crosses, the speed increases. So I pull on the stick. But pulling on the stick on a plane that's like this won't control the altitude at all. We'll keep tightening the turn and increasing acceleration. What effect will that have? The acceleration will create a local vertical, because we're going to feel two things. We're going to feel this. If I'm in any place, do you see this corner? Yes, you see it. If I take here, I have this is Earth's gravity. I'm going to add an acceleration like this, and then my resulting acceleration, that's it. Okay, that's the resulting acceleration. You see it, and that's my local vertical. What I feel in my body, ears, brain, and senses. The thing is, it's vertical, but actually my plane is tilted like this, you see, though it feels vertical to me. By the way, if you have a glass of water, if you have a bottle of water in the cockpit, the water will be horizontal, okay? You can do this. Even go up to 80 degrees, the water will stay horizontal. The water, you have the bottle, look, you have the bottle, the water, it doesn't move, the water doesn't move. A label here fell exactly. That's Murphy's Law. So look at the bottle. Don't think for a second that if the plane tilts, it's going to do that. No, it doesn't do that at all because the water will respond to the local vertical. Look, I'm going to show you something. Okay, you can see that the water didn't fall. Look, I do this. Did the water fall? Wait, here. I'm doing it slowly. Now I'll do it quickly. You can see that the water doesn't fall. You can take a bottle, put a string on it, spin it. You'll see. You can even use a camera that takes a lot of frames per second and you stop it. And you'll see that the bottle is like this and the water stays at the bottom of the bottle. All right, people who say yes, but why don't we just look at a bottle of water? It doesn't work. The story of the water bottle is about how your inner ear works because your inner ear is made of water. All right, so the water bottle gets soaked, your inner ear gets soaked, your senses get soaked, the instruments for that reason. So what's happening here is that our plane, and this is very well known, there's no one who's better than anyone else. If you go into the clouds without training, you die. There are people who survive to talk about it. Why? Simply because they were lucky. When they lost control, they came out of the clouds, they had water under the keel, they were at a certain altitude. If he loses control at 3,000 feet and exits at 2,500 feet, he sees that the plane is in a desperate situation, but he can recover, reduce the throttle, bring the wings level by the nearest horizon, by the quickest way, start to pull up, calm things down. We almost got scared. But in practice, most often, when there are fatal accidents like the one we're talking about today, like the one involving Julian Clear's brother, and many, many others, it's that when they come out of the clouds, there's no more time, they come out of the clouds. You have time to count to two, then it's the impact. So here, what happened is that what you see here was done here. It's that here, something like this, okay? And that's the impact. So the impact happened roughly at 180. So roughly like this, okay? The impact. The plane went for 50 meters, caught fire on impact, and all 5 occupants were killed. and we found the landing gear was down. The Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis said that maybe he didn't have time to retract the landing gear, but I doubt it. He has a 3,000-meter runway here and 3,050 meters in Grenoble. He wanted to enter from the middle, but wasn't allowed, so he started from the beginning. I think he had enough time to retract the landing gear. I've often seen spirals, and there are so many jets in a spiral. It's not the first time that when there are too many jets, this can happen, especially with small planes like that. You have the landing gear coming out, it comes out because of the number of jets. That means it's going to come out and you find it in the extended position. But that doesn't necessarily mean the pilot extended it himself or forgot to retract it. Okay, so impact. And so they all died. It's something quite, how should I say? It's because why? Because when they came out of the clouds, remember, the clouds are at 700 feet, the ground rises a bit. So roughly, by the time they come out of the clouds, there's about 300 feet. We're talking about 100 meters, 100 meters. If you have a plane that's really steep, going very fast, I'll add that too. One detail maybe is that when I do tests in a real plane to try to understand a little bit what's going on, there's another phenomenon that we don't talk about. You realize it during these tests, I'll tell you, you're right in the middle of it. When the speed increases, there are several things already. You have the speed increasing, and then you have the airflow. There's a rush of air that increases, but exponentially. So the rush of air is quite frightening. It's a very strong gust, and you can feel that you're going fast even when you can't see. And then the other thing, it could be the propellers overspeeding, because the propeller governor tries to control when the speed increases. There are times when you can have that, especially with the throttle open. If you were climbing or at takeoff power, you could potentially have an increase in engine speed. So that can also add to the situation, if you will, and create stress. It's clear that when we leave the clouds with enough altitude, the pilot immediately sees and understands what happened. At that point, he can correct, but most of the time, like in this case, no, you don't correct anything at all. You come out, you don't have time to recover anything. These are desperate situations. You need about, let's say on average, at least 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet to talk about it. Below that, no, below that, you're going to hit the ground. So there you go, my friends. Since it's January, and in January, what kills most often is that visual meteorological conditions, instrument meteorological conditions. What also kills is icing. Be very careful about icing. I need to make a video or two about that. So, and raising awareness, we're not going to stop here. There will be other topics coming to reiterate this point, to hammer it in so that it finally sinks in. Since the flying clubs aren't doing enough, we'll try to handle it ourselves on YouTube. Thank you to those who support this channel by subscribing to the paid section, getting access to exclusive videos that can also be found on this channel's Patreon. Thanks again also to the pilots who support this channel with advice, documentation, help, and also analysis. They share their experience with me so that I can also share it with you.